I'm the scale model geek, and in this video I'm going to build a car out of an aircraft because hey, that's what I do. And for the base kit I'm using this Revell Junkers Stuka kit. It's in 1/32 scale and was originally released back in 1969. I originally bought this kit way back in the 90s and it only cost me like 26 bucks. And I thought that was expensive in those days. Of course this diorama is going to need a figure, and I've got this one from Loot. As good as this dude looks, it's not quite right because in his right arm, behind his shoulder, he's actually carrying a briefcase. So I need to get rid of that and replace it with a helmet. I've also got these wheels from Thingiverse. This kit is now 55 years old, and boy does it show its age. The detail is terrible, lots of flash in it, and these pilots, they're supposed to be German pilots, but they look Japanese. I don't know if they use the same sprue or whatever they did, but they're awful. And thank God for 3D printers because I can easily replace those pilots. Now, talking about replacing, I needed to make some alterations to the original figure from Loot. Now I need to get rid of that briefcase that he's carrying and replace it with a helmet that I got from Thingiverse. There's this great tool in this software called Blender, which is called Boolean. I think that's how you pronounce it. And basically what it does is you create a shape and then you can subtract from other shapes. So it's effectively erasing other areas. Effectively what I do, I just keep on rotating and resizing this cube until I remove as much of the bits that I don't need. Now this is a bit of a lengthy process. I'm sure there's other tools in Blender that you can make this job a lot easier. I'm still learning, so it's a bit of a trial and error for me. And this is the helmet that I downloaded from Thingiverse. It is a composite of about 2 or 3 different helmets that I downloaded and kind of created this unique one-of-a-kind helmet that suits my needs. With Blender I kind of just fumble around trying to work out what tools do which, and I watched a couple of YouTube videos, but I kind of decided I need to do something about this and improve my skills. Every time I would try to create a model from scratch I would run into issues and completely fail and waste my time. This is where I need to discover new skills in 3D design, and I reached out to Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry pros across film, illustration, design, painting, crafting, music and beyond. You see, hobbies aren't just activities we do to pass the time. They're windows into our souls, expressions of our passions and avenues for self-discovery. Think about it, whether it's painting, gardening, cooking or even underwater basket weaving. Yeah, that's the thing. Hobbies allow us to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life and enter into a world where time seems to stand still. Skillshare gives us the chance to explore our interests, push our boundaries and unleash our creativity in ways we've never thought possible. Skillshare had the perfect 5-part program with Blender for me. The professional took me from learning the interface through to animation and then rendering the final model. I highly recommend Skillshare as you discover from industry professionals how to create unlimited worlds from your imagination. And the first 500 people to use my link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. The link is in the description, and thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now this figure is 75mm, so I will need to shrink him down to 1/32 scale, which makes him about 56mm in height. Since its release in 1969, this kit has been reboxed 9 times and has had decals redone 3 times. I would probably recommend they retool it because it's a bit of a rubbish kit. My plan is pretty much to modify just about everything of this kit. In fact, I don't think there's going to be anything that I won't modify. I've got a funny feeling most of it will end up in the box. I'll be using the hull. I'll be chopping off the tail, not even using any of the wings. Even the cockpit's going to be heavily modified. Yeah, pretty much a kit bash. In retrospect, I should have probably completed doing the cockpit before I put the hull around it. Kit bashing is probably one of my favourite forms of modelling. I really like taking bits and pieces from other craft and putting them all together and creating something unique. And with the advent of 3D printing, that just adds more detail that I could, well, put into the build. Now I've chopped off the tail here and just making sure I put an end to it and just glued it straight on and just clipping it off. Then as soon as it dries I'll file it. There was a bit of filling and sanding that I need to do on this kit because it's a rubbish kit. And I also sanded off all the rivets because I'll be replacing them a little bit later. Now here I'm just using a piece of paper to create a template so I can fill in those joints where the wings used to be. And just cut it out with a pair of scissors and then place it onto a piece of styrene sheet. Trace it and then cut it out. The styrene that I used was really thin, so it was extremely easy to cut with just a pair of scissors. And I find that it's just a lot quicker, a little bit more precise using the scissors, and then I can go in and do some final touches with a bit of a file or a bit of sandpaper to get it right. But this I just find a lot easier than trying to scribe it out with a hobby knife. I'm all about trying to make it as easy as possible. Here I try and align the top section as close as possible. It just makes it a lot easier for me to sand, because the other side I can always just trim away. And with every model kit that I build, there is so much sanding, filling and filing and filling and sanding. It never seems to end. Anyway, for the tracks, I found these on a Thingiverse and I printed them out on my 3D printer, and I also designed this rear axle. And I'm still kind of umming and ahhing whether to have tracks or to have wheels on the front. Here I'm just grinding out a section so I can stick the axle on. So get it to slightly recess into the body, and a bit of styrene glue once again. And I did end up adding a bit of araldite, which is a 5-minute epoxy, just to give a bit of strength. And this is a slightly larger rod to fit over the axle. That way I can easily remove them for painting. Now this next bit, I kind of was looking at this rear axle I designed and it just didn't look right. It just wasn't convincing me at all. The rear wheel and the pitch of the vehicle just didn't look right, so I'll have to have a think about that one. Now I haven't done scribing in such a long time, so this was a bit of a learning curve for me once again, and just marking out the areas where I need to do the scribing. I'm using the trumpeter scribing tool here. Turned out to be a lot easier than I thought it would be. Now because I've sanded off all the rivets, I'm going to need to replace them. I created these tiny 1.5mm rivets in Blender and then 3D printed them, and all I need to do to use them is to break them off, chop off the stem and then super glue them into place. Good news, it's an easy way of replacing the rivets. Bad news, there's a gazillion of them to do. But I do believe it'll be well worth the time. Plus, maybe a little bit relaxing as well. Now to add a bit of visual interest, rather than having rivets on where the wings should be, I've used these nuts and bolts that I've designed in Blender. When I print these out, I usually print hundreds of them, just so I can throw into my stash. You know, I've got a little box that I put all my rivets in there, rivets and nuts and bolts and all those little goodies. So whenever I need them, they're there, they're ready for me to go. These ones I printed about 4 years ago, and I've been able to use them for quite a number of builds. Another thing I need to do is create a cover for that air intake, just to block it off. Same process as when I did the tail, glue on the piece of plastic, let it dry, then file it to shape. These ejector seats I found on Thingiverse and I slightly modified them to suit my needs. And these are exactly the same exhausts as I used on my landship diorama, so go check that one out. Remember how I mentioned that I didn't like the pitch of the craft, so I decided to move the axle so slightly higher up in the body. That will lower the nose, because that just didn't seem right, it was too high. I also decided that I'll move away from the tracks and use these wheels. They're basically a larger size of the rear wheel. That just made the whole concept a bit more cohesive. Here I'm just drilling the holes for the exhaust system. I really like the idea of having 2 exhausts on each side, because it kind of looks cool. Bit of super glue to hold them into place. And at this stage, you know, I'm really happy with this build so far. It's come together really nicely. And those rivets, though they took a bit of time, look fantastic. In the end, I ended up redesigning the rear axle just to something that would look better with this configuration. Rather than having the single wheel, I ended up using 2 wheels and changing it from a horizontal configuration to a vertical. And that looks so much better. It actually looks like it works. With the construction done, it's time to start painting. Now I'm using some of this light green from Vallejo, And that'll be my base color for the majority of the interior. I'll use some of this panel line accent color from Tamiya to bring out a lot of the detail within the cockpit. And all I'm doing is just flooding the whole cockpit with it, making sure it gets into all the crevices. And once it dries, all that glossy finish to it will disappear. And I also added some of the accent color to the seats as well. And to bring out even more detail, I'm using some of this dry brushing paint from Ammo, and this one's called the medium green. And just a light coat to hit all the edges. And this really brings everything to life. And you can see the glossiness from the previous step is all gone. Bit of super glue to hold those seats into place. And I'm really loving that interior. It looks really good. Very happy with that. Now I hit the greeblies box and I made up the steering wheel. And I super glued that into place as well. And the back needed a control panel. So again, the greeblies, and I'm using a dial there out of a 1/24 scale decal sheet. And that's the interior pretty much done. The details come out so nice in that cockpit. Now onto probably one of the worst things I hate doing in any model build, and that's masking, and especially masking clear parts. That's a nightmare for me. I used Tamiya masking tape for the outside of the canopy, and on the inside some general masking tape. And that's just to protect it from any overspray. And of course the cockpit area needs to be masked up as well for the body to be sprayed. For the body I used Vallejo's olive drab. That took about 3 coats to get a nice even coverage. And the wheels copped it as well. I always worry about masking on clear parts in case it bleeds underneath. When it does that, it always looks awful. Nothing special here, just some flat black for the tyres. Again, a nice even coat around there. And some Vallejo rust for the exhaust pipe. Now I want to add some markings to the vehicle, so I went through a whole stash of old decal sheets that I had, and I'm just going to pick some random pieces and kind of, get it looking like it's supposed to be there. Now this is some German marking. I think it is off another aircraft, a really old one that I've had. No idea what it's from. And this is maybe some Star Trek-y, spacey type decals there. And a red stripe to finish it off at the back there. Surprisingly, they came up great as well. And now some of this medium green once again to dry brush the whole vehicle. Now I dry brush the canopy while the masking tape's still on there, so it doesn't affect any of the clear areas. Dry brushing is one of my favourite parts of the painting process because it brings out so much detail and also brings the model to life. This simple technique brings out so much detail, and you can see all the rivets starting to pop. How good is that? All because of dry brushing. And here he comes. Have I got bleeding? Holding my breath. And no, absolutely came out wonderful. I didn't get one single piece of bleeding in the whole canopy at all. So happy with that. Very proud of myself. Well done, geek. What's your favourite part of the building process? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. Is it construction? Is it painting? Dry brushing? Just let me know whatever it is. The joints of the clear parts of the canopy are a bit rubbish. They don't really go down too well. So lucky it's going to be open so you won't notice it. Some more of this dry brushing paint from Ammo. This is the dark Panzer Grey. And just hitting the tyres with it just before I start weathering them. With all the detailing and dry brushing done, it's time to assemble the whole thing. The wheels I've never glued into place, but I will be gluing the actual tyres to the base. The rear axle finally gets attached to the body. And then we move on to weathering. This is the dark brown from Vallejo. It's a wash. And the whole model gets a spritz of water, and that'll stop the wash from pooling up. And gives it a nice more even flow to the wash. And as you can see, I'm being very generous with the coverage. While that's drying, I can move on to the base. Here I'm using a mixture of tile grout and water. Now the reason I'm using tile grout is as it dries it looks a bit more sandy. It's got a little bit more texture compared to plaster of Paris, which I've been using previously. Now this stuff hardens very quickly, so I made it fairly thin into sort of like a thick cream. That way it gives me time to actually spread it. As it starts to dry, you can see the texture starting to come out in the surface. Now I'm using an extra wheel that I'd printed up to create some tracks, so it looks like the vehicle has actually interacted with the terrain. Now I've put that aside to let it dry as well, and it's onto the figure. First step is to give the figure a base coat of black undercoat, and then I'm using some white from Liquitex. This is the titanium white for the zenithal lighting. And basically what that is just spraying from one direction to give it a bit of highlight, so it brings out, all the shadow areas. I then go in and block out all my colours. I usually start off with the flesh tones, then move on to the garments. Full transparency, I'm just picking colours by random and kind of thinking, oh yeah, that looks good, and I use it. Once I've done all that and I'm happy with my colour choices, I then go back and start adding all the highlights. These type of vehicles come from a genre called diesel punk, and it's basically set in the 1940s, where they take that era technology and make anything like spacecraft to huge zeppelins and crazy vehicles, particularly like the one I'm building today. I'm about 80% happy with that figure. In retrospect, I probably should have picked a different colour for the vest. Now onto detailing that base, which is on a piece of XPS foam. Now I'm going to add a bit of colour, starting off with some of this dark flesh tone, and I'm just mottling the surface just to add a bit of visual interest. And now I'm about to do some static grass, and I place the vehicle there just so I have a rough idea where I want the grass to be. And the static grass applicator there from Pico, and I use 4mm autumn grass. Once the PVA glue had dried, I used some desert sand colour from Vallejo and just painted the whole thing to add a bit of cohesion in the final colour. And to tie in the colours even more, a bit of dry brushing, some paint from Ammo. And to add the final detail to the foliage, I've got some of these dry grass tufts, and I just glued them into place with some PVA glue. I've also got some dried plants. They look like little bushes where they've pretty much died off. As bad as the Revell kit was, this has actually been one of my favourite builds that I've done for this channel. I've got 2 or 3 more techniques for weathering before we finalise the diorama. First, it's a combination of that Vallejo pigment as well as the sepia wash to create some rust texture onto exhaust pipe. And then some pastel chalk, which I ground down on a piece of sandpaper. Then use this toothbrush to get it out of the sandpaper because it kind of embeds itself in there. Added a bit of water and created a sort of like a grainy wash, and then covered all the tyres. Once that dries, it looks like accumulated dust within the tyres. Now to glue the vehicle down, some of that 5-minute Araldite on all 3 tyres. And then I align it to the tyre tracks that I created in the surface of that base. And the final weathering technique to make it look like it's part of the environment is some more pastel chalk, and I'm just dusting it onto the bottom of the vehicle as well as the back and also the tyres. I'm being extremely generous with the pastel chalk, making sure it gets everywhere. I think when you're in a desert type environment, you need to have dust pretty much everywhere. So with that said, I think it's time we go check out the glamour shots. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end, and you know what, this has been such a fun build to do. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what you think, and if you like what I created, go and check out these other post-apocalyptic scenes that I've done in previous months.